In a Bombshell Revelation, straight from behind prison walls, R. Kelly's legal team has dropped a chilling claim that officials within the United States Bureau of Prisons allegedly tried to orchestrate his unaliving by recruiting a terminally ill inmate to carry out the act. Not only did the inmate refuse, but he allegedly warned Kelly that his life was in real danger. Is this a twisted abuse of power at the highest level? And if true, what does it say about the system that's supposed to uphold justice? This isn't just a prison story. It's a wake-up call. This episode contains sensitive content related to allegations of institutional abuse, targeted violence, and systemic corruption within the United States prison system. While we will not use explicit language, some descriptions may be emotionally distressing, particularly for those who have experienced incarceration, abuse of authority, or legal injustice. Please listen with care and use your discretion. If at any point this episode feels overwhelming, feel free to pause, breathe, and return when you're ready. Welcome to Life Points with Ronda, the space where truth meets compassion and no story goes untold. Today's episode takes us deep into a developing legal firestorm. One that's not just raising eyebrows, but serious questions about corruption, power, and protection within the United States prison system. R. Kelly, the once celebrated R&B singer, now serving a 31-year federal sentence, is back in the headlines. But this time, it's not about his past. It's about what his legal team says is happening right now behind prison walls. According to a new emergency motion filed in federal court, Kelly's attorneys claim that officials from the Bureau of Prisons allegedly approached a terminally ill inmate to carry out a deadly attack against him and promised the man favors in return. Now, let's be clear. These are allegations, and this is still unfolding, but the implications are staggering. If true, it's not just about one man's safety. It's about the entire framework of institutional accountability. Because when the people who are supposed to protect the incarcerated become part of the threat, where does that leave justice? We're going to break down what's been filed, who's involved, the timing of this new motion, and what it could mean for Kelly's sentence and safety, as well as what this reveals about broader systemic failures. Whether you support him or not, this episode isn't about personal opinion. It's about understanding the legal and moral gravity of what's being claimed. Before we get into it, go ahead and smash that like button if you're here for real talk, deep dives, and truth without the fluff. It helps push this video out to more people. And trust me, this is a conversation that needs to be heard. And if you're feeling the vibe, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next drop. This channel is just getting started, and we're going to keep pulling back the layers, one truth at a time. All right, I know your time is valuable. So let's get started, okay? And dive into the episode. On June 10th, 2025, R. Kelly's legal team filed a shocking emergency motion in North Carolina federal court. And honestly, its contents are the kind of thing that reads more like a movie script than a legal document. According to the motion, 3 officials from the Bureau of Prisons allegedly conspired to have Kelly unalived while in federal custody. The key claim? That these officials approached a terminally ill inmate, Mikeal Stine, a man who is reportedly affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood, and asked him to carry out an unaliving attempt on Kelly's life in exchange for a favor. And not just any favor. We're talking about a promise of escape or some form of leniency in his final days. Let that sink in for a moment. Federal employees allegedly tried to weaponize a dying man, already facing his own mortality, as a tool for silent retribution. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. According to the motion, Stine didn't go along with the plan. Instead, he allegedly warned Kelly, telling him everything, including the names of the officials involved. He even detailed the exact promise that was allegedly made to him in exchange for carrying out the attack. And now, Kelly's lawyers are using that testimony to argue for an immediate release from prison and transfer to house arrest. Let's pause here for a second. If this is true, and I really want to stress that if this would represent a level of corruption and negligence that cuts to the core of the justice system. The Bureau of Prisons is tasked with protecting all inmates, regardless of their charges or convictions. Even someone like R. Kelly, who has been convicted of serious crimes, is still entitled under the Constitution to safety, dignity, and the protection of life while incarcerated. Kelly's team states that this isn't an isolated situation. They point to previous threats, alleged mistreatment, and multiple failures by the system to protect him from harm. And they argue that keeping him behind bars at this point, knowing there's a real and documented threat, amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. Now, here's what's really wild. The motion states that not only was this plan premeditated, but that Kelly's legal team believes his life remains in active danger. This isn't something they're casually dropping. This is a full-blown emergency request. They're asking the court to release him immediately into home confinement to save his life. Not because of celebrity privilege, not because of fame, but because they believe the system is actively failing him, or worse, targeting him. No matter how you feel about R. Kelly, whether you're someone who believes he deserves the full weight of the law, or someone who thinks he was unfairly targeted, the idea that a federal system might be participating in or permitting targeted harm against any incarcerated individual is not something we can just ignore. This section of the motion is a line in the sand. It's not about innocence or guilt. It's about the sacred responsibility of justice systems to function with integrity. And when the people we trust to uphold that system become the accused, that's when the whole house starts shaking. To fully understand the weight of this motion and why it's sending ripples through both the legal world and the public, we need to look closely at the man at the center of the allegation, Mikeal Stine. Now, on the surface, Stine doesn't exactly seem like someone you'd expect to be protecting R. Kelly. In fact, he's a convicted white supremacist, allegedly affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood. He's been locked up for years. And according to court records, And what's been confirmed through public sources, Stine is terminally ill. This is someone who reportedly has little time left. A man staring down the end of his own life. So why is this important? Because the Bureau of Prisons allegedly saw this exact situation, a dying inmate with nothing to lose, as an opportunity. According to the emergency motion, Stine was approached by 3 prison officials who proposed what can only be described as a morally bankrupt exchange. Take out R. Kelly, and, in return, they would either help him escape or drastically ease the remainder of his prison term. Stine, however, did something unexpected. He refused. Not only did he turn it down, but he reportedly told Kelly everything. The officials' names, the promises made, the reason they chose him, and most critically, he warned Kelly that his life was in real danger. Now, let's pause again here and reflect on the psychological gravity of that moment. You've got a dying man, someone who, based on his criminal background and affiliations, the public might assume to be violent or, at the very least, indifferent to R. Kelly's life. But instead of taking the bait, he chooses to speak out. And that decision might have saved Kelly's life. But this also opens a much darker door. If what Stine is alleging is true, that Bureau officials intentionally exploited his health, his sentence, and his situation, then we are talking about a gross abuse of institutional power. Not just negligence, intentional orchestration of harm. That's not just unethical, that's criminal. And let's not forget the racial and political undertones here. If you have officials within the federal prison system allegedly aligning with a white supremacist inmate to target a high-profile black prisoner, even one convicted of horrific crimes, the implications go far beyond R. Kelly. They speak to a possible culture of corruption, racism, and moral decay embedded in parts of the very system designed to rehabilitate or protect. Mikeal Glenn Stine's background matters. His status as a dying inmate matters. His refusal matters. And the fact that he's the one blowing the whistle, not Kelly, not an outside activist, but a fellow inmate with no obvious reason to lie. Gives this story a level of credibility that is deeply uncomfortable for the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice. And here's where things get even more complicated. Kelly's legal team is now using Stine's testimony as the foundation of their emergency request for house arrest. They're arguing that this isn't just a rumor. This isn't speculation. This is a first-hand account from the very person the Bureau allegedly tried to use as a weapon. So now the legal system has to decide, do they believe this man? Do they act on it? Or do they ignore it and risk something even more tragic happening on their watch? Now, here's where the situation shifts from disturbing to strategic. R. Kelly's legal team didn't just whisper about these allegations in closed chambers. They filed a public emergency motion. Loud, clear, on the record. And that decision was deliberate. So the question becomes, why now? Why take this public? Why go this hard and this fast with an allegation this explosive? Let's look at the timing. Kelly's team has been working aggressively behind the scenes to overturn his convictions or reduce his sentence. He's currently serving 31 years in 2 separate federal cases, one in New York for racketeering and trafficking, and another in Illinois for child pornography and obstruction. He's been appealing both, claiming prosecutorial misconduct, unfair treatment, and due process violations. But those appeals, they're moving slowly. And in the meantime, his attorneys claim his safety has been repeatedly compromised. According to them, Kelly has already been attacked in prison before. He's reportedly faced isolation, threats, and now, if this motion is accurate, he's being targeted from inside the system itself. So, legally speaking, going public right now actually serves multiple purposes. First, there's urgency and public pressure. By filing an emergency motion and making it public, Kelly's team is applying pressure, not just on the court, but also on the public narrative. They're really creating a sense of urgency because honestly, if something were to happen to Kelly now, after this has been filed, the system can no longer plead ignorance. They're on notice. Second, they're laying the foundation for civil action. This move also lays the groundwork for potential civil rights lawsuits. If Kelly's legal team can prove that officials conspired or knowingly allowed attempts on his life, they could sue the Bureau of Prisons and the federal government for violation of Eighth Amendment rights, cruel and unusual punishment, and, systemic misconduct. Third, they're reframing the public image. Let's be honest, public opinion about R. Kelly is deeply divided, and for good reason. The charges and convictions against him are serious. But in the legal world, no matter what you've been convicted of, your rights don't disappear once you're behind bars. Kelly's lawyers are using this moment to reframe the conversation, to remind the public that even the most vilified figures are still entitled to protection from targeted harm. This strategy helps soften public resistance toward granting him house arrest. Fourth, they're creating a record of accountability. In federal litigation, documentation is everything. By putting this motion on the record, Kelly's team is also creating legal receipts. If any future harm comes to him, they've already documented the threat, the names, the situation, and the government's awareness. This creates a heavy burden of accountability for the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice. And finally, they're setting up for a humanitarian release. Let's not forget that Kelly's legal team is also arguing for release to home confinement. This isn't a bid for total freedom. It's a bid for survival. They're positioning it as a human rights issue, not a criminal one. In some cases, especially those involving medical or life-threatening circumstances, courts have granted temporary release or house arrest pending appeal. By alleging that Kelly's life is in immediate danger, they're trying to qualify him for one of those rare exceptions. But this also begs another question. Will it work? Because now the court must choose between ignoring a documented death threat or granting a form of relief to a man convicted of unthinkable crimes. And that, honestly, puts the entire justice system on trial. It's no longer just about R. Kelly. It's about the morality and legality of how we treat the incarcerated, and whether the law applies evenly when someone is no longer in the public's good graces. Let's take a step back and examine what these allegations mean on a larger scale, because this is no longer just a case about R. Kelly or even Michael Glenn Stine. The spotlight is now squarely on the Bureau of Prisons, the very institution charged with safely housing those convicted by the justice system. If even a portion of these claims are true, we're no longer talking about isolated misconduct. We're staring at the possibility of systemic corruption inside the federal prison system, where people in power allegedly used their authority to put a man's life at risk, and not through negligence, through an orchestrated plan. So, we have to ask, are we dealing with a few rogue officers, or are we witnessing something far more disturbing? A culture of cruelty that's gone unchecked. The Bureau of Prisons already has a history of scandals. Let's not forget, the BOP has faced serious scrutiny in the past. From Jeffrey Epstein's death in custody to rampant allegations of abuse, sexual assault, and medical neglect across multiple facilities. This isn't the first time the institution has come under fire. There have been reports of officers trafficking, contraband, abusing inmates, falsifying documents, and turning a blind eye to violence. In 2022, the Justice Department called the BOP one of the most broken agencies in the federal government. So these new allegations against R. Kelly's facility don't exist in a vacuum. They fit into an already troubled pattern. And what makes this even more complicated? The lack of accountability. Most internal investigations never result in criminal charges. Officers are rarely fired. Whistleblowers often face retaliation. And the people most affected, the inmates, are considered unreliable, regardless of how credible their claims might be. It's a system stacked in favor of silence. This case could really blow the lid off that silence. By publicly naming 3 specific Bureau of Prisons officials in a legal filing, Kelly's team has essentially drawn a red circle around the Bureau's dirty laundry. They're calling out individuals, not just policies. And that's huge. Because now, those officers will either have to be investigated, or the Bureau risks being accused of covering up a conspiracy. If a judge takes this seriously and orders an outside inquiry, we could be looking at more inmates coming forward, more stories of abuse, and potentially a full-scale federal review. And if the Bureau doesn't act, if they try to dismiss this motion as the desperate move of a convicted celebrity, that, too, will speak volumes. And it will erode what little public trust is left in the prison system. This isn't just about justice. It's about optics. Let's be real. The public is watching. The media is watching. And now that this motion has gone viral, so are politicians, activists, and legal watchdogs. Whether or not people feel sympathy for R. Kelly is irrelevant at this point. Because this is no longer about his music, his past, or even his guilt. It's about what happens when a person is in the custody of the state, and the state becomes complicit in harm. If the people we entrust with the care and custody of inmates can be bought, corrupted, or allowed to act without consequence, then the entire foundation of criminal justice becomes unstable. The moment we accept that certain people are too guilty to deserve safety, we invite a collapse of moral boundaries that affects everyone. And if we ignore this because it's R. Kelly, what happens when it's someone else? Someone who doesn't have a legal team, a platform, or a name we recognize? This case has cracked open a door the Bureau of Prisons would rather keep sealed. And now the question is, will anyone be brave enough to walk through it? Or will the system slam it shut again before the truth fully comes out? Let's talk about the question on everyone's mind. Can R. Kelly actually get out of prison over this? And if so, how? The answer is complicated, but not impossible. What Kelly's legal team is asking for isn't full exoneration. They're not trying to reverse his conviction through this motion. What they're seeking is something called compassionate release or temporary home confinement on the basis of a life-threatening situation. And here's the thing, under federal law, that is technically possible. The legal mechanism is Section 3582, subsection C, 1A of the United States Code. This section allows a judge to reduce a federal inmate's sentence or authorize home confinement if there are extraordinary and compelling reasons that justify it. Typically, this statute is used for inmates with terminal illnesses, severe disabilities, or urgent humanitarian crises. But in rare cases, it has also been invoked when a prisoner's life is in credible danger and the prison system has failed to protect them. Kelly's legal team is arguing that he meets that threshold. They're saying he's not just at risk, he was allegedly the target of a premeditated, unaliving attempt involving prison staff. And he has proof from the very person who was allegedly recruited to carry it out. That's not just extraordinary, that's terrifying. So, what would home confinement look like? If granted, Kelly wouldn't walk out as a free man. He'd be confined to a residence approved by the court, likely with electronic monitoring, curfews, random check-ins, and honestly, very little privacy. He would still be serving his sentence, just outside the walls of a federal prison, under close surveillance. In other words, it's not freedom. It's protection, under punishment. But what's the likelihood? Now here's where it gets tricky. Judges tend to be cautious, especially in high-profile cases. And given Kelly's criminal history, some may feel that granting release, even temporary, could cause public backlash. The court would need to weigh the credibility of the threat, the proof submitted by his legal team, the government's response, and the legal precedent it could set. Also, the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons will absolutely push back. They're likely to claim that Kelly is safe, that protocols are in place, and that the system is equipped to manage the risk. But if the motion includes names, dates, and written testimony from Mikeal Stine, the judge may have no choice but to order an investigation. And that could delay or fast-track a decision, depending on what gets uncovered. There's also the middle ground option. If the judge feels full release is too risky, they could order that Kelly be transferred to a new facility, away from the alleged conspirators, possibly even a medical facility, or lower security prison. That may not solve the underlying issue of systemic trust, but it could provide short-term safety while the legal team continues to fight behind the scenes. And let's not forget, public pressure matters. This is where media, advocacy groups, and your voice come into play. When there's public interest and documentation, cases are less likely to be swept under the rug. The court knows the world is watching, and that can shift outcomes. Quiet cases die in silence. Public ones leave trails. So, can R. Kelly be released? Yes, but only under exceptional circumstances. And right now, his legal team is doing everything in their power to prove that those circumstances are staring us in the face. Let's get real for a moment, because this is the part of the conversation where things get uncomfortable. And honestly, that's exactly why it needs to be had. Because when people hear R. Kelly might get released to house arrest, the first reaction for many is outrage. And understandably so. The allegations against him, the convictions, the trauma of survivors, they've left deep emotional wounds in the culture, especially within the Black community. But here's the problem. We're confusing justice with vengeance. And in doing so, we're blurring the line between punishment and inhumanity. Let's be clear. This isn't a conversation about whether R. Kelly is guilty. The courts have ruled. The law has spoken. He's serving time. But what's now being raised is a question that transcends one man. Do even the most vilified people deserve basic human rights while incarcerated? If your answer is no, that once someone is convicted, anything that happens to them in prison is fair game, then ask yourself this. What happens when that person is your loved one? What happens when the system targets the wrong person? What happens when justice is used as a shield for brutality? Because if we're okay with a celebrity being used as target practice behind bars, if we shrug off claims that officials may have plotted his death, then we're not building a system of justice. We're building a machine of revenge. And history has shown us who that machine crushes first. It's easy to say, not him. It's harder to say, not anyone. But the truth is, if we can't protect the worst among us from harm, we've got no shot at protecting the innocent. The emotional conflict is real, y'all. Let's name it. There's a deep tension in the culture around this case. There are people who believe R. Kelly should never be free again. There are survivors whose voices still echo from courtroom testimony. There are those who feel that any form of protection for him, even from unaliving, is a betrayal of those he harmed. And that's real. That pain is real. That anger is valid. But none of it erases constitutional rights. And none of it makes an attempted conspiracy by government agents excusable. It's possible to hold multiple truths. That R. Kelly was convicted of heinous crimes. That survivors deserve justice and healing. And that allowing harm to come to him behind bars is a human rights violation, not justice. What we tolerate sets the precedent. When we say, well, it's just R. Kelly, so who cares? We open the door for the system to decide who else doesn't deserve care. Today, it's him. Tomorrow, it's someone who couldn't afford a good lawyer. Someone wrongly convicted. Someone Black and poor. Someone whose name never makes headlines. So while this episode is centered on a controversial man, the lesson goes far beyond celebrity. How a system treats the condemned is the purest test of its morality. There's a painful but powerful truth that we have to sit with at the end of this conversation. Justice is not one-sided. It doesn't bend toward fame, and it doesn't shrink in the face of infamy. True justice demands that we rise above personal feelings, even when those feelings are justified. It asks us to hold systems accountable, even when we think the person inside that system deserves the pain they're experiencing. Because the moment we let the system become selective, when we let cruelty masquerade as punishment, we've already lost the moral high ground. And history has shown us That kind of system never stops at one person. It spreads, it mutates, and eventually it swallows people who were never meant to be victims in the first place. We're watching a moment unfold where someone who's been publicly condemned is now crying out, not for release from guilt, but for protection from harm. And we have to ask ourselves, as a culture, are we okay with silence? Are we okay with looking the other way when a system that claims to protect begins to prey? Are we okay letting institutions carry out violence in our name simply because the person on the receiving end is unpopular? This isn't about agreeing with R. Kelly. It's about asking, who's next? Because once injustice becomes acceptable in any form, it becomes unstoppable in every form. So whether you stand with survivors, demand justice reform, or simply believe in the basic rights of every human being, this conversation matters because it forces us to ask, what kind of justice do we really believe in? If this episode gave you something to think about, if it stirred something in your spirit, hit that like button. It's not just a button. It tells the algorithm that truth still matters. Be sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because we're going to keep digging into the stories that most platforms are afraid to touch. And if you have thoughts, reflections, or even respectful disagreements, I welcome you to drop them in the comments. This is a space for real conversation, for elevation, for clarity, and for growth. Because here at Life Points with Ronda, we're not afraid to go where the truth leads us, even when it's uncomfortable. Until next time, stay grounded, stay discerning, and remember, justice doesn't need our comfort. It needs our courage.